Hi, 8th graders. It is Monday, February the 8th, and we are finishing up with our verb chapter. You will have, it's not really a full test on this because the chapter is so short, but later in the week you will take a test for chapter 6, and then you will, there'll be some review on there as well. So we're finishing up with this chapter this week, and then we'll be moving on once we get back from winter break. So if you do not have your book, please grab your book and turn to page 330. It's hard to believe we are so far into the book, but we are cranking along in the school year. And we will be taking a look at the gray box, so make sure you get your book open so that we can talk about what is in the gray box. So we know that in the active voice, it's pretty obvious that we use a transitive verb. And remember, the transitive verb is the one that you can see in your head. It's the action that you can see in your head. And it often passes its action to a direct object. But if you look at the second point in the gray box, the transitive verb in passive voice can pass its action back to the subject. We're going to look at some examples of that. The passive voice may be used in all 6 tenses, and we will see some examples. And then a few things, the progressive form of the passive voice occurs mainly in the simple present and past tenses. Emphatic form does not occur at all in the passive voice. Just some things to tuck away in your memory. And then a new concept that we have not talked about before, this is a new 8th grade concept, is the retained object. This can be a little confusing. It can also be a little argumentative, and I'll show you why when we get to the end of the lesson. So let's go ahead. And I apologize if you hear my dog barking like crazy in the background. She's trying to say hello. All right, so let's first take a look at verbs in the active voice. The active voice is the more direct way that we communicate. It does not tend to use helping verbs or to be verbs. It's just generally the action. Mom baked the cake. We see that direct object pop up at the end. So here's an example. Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt, and we know that Moses is the subject. Moses led who or what, and that would be the Israelites. So this one's pretty easy. That's the active. Now I tend to write in passive quite a bit, and that means that I'm using helping verbs in a lot of prepositional phrases. So if you think in those terms, the inactive or the passive voice is using helping verbs, and you also are probably going to find prepositional phrases popping up. You know that I love prepositional phrases, so that is probably why I write in the passive voice. Now the passive voice, instead of passing its action to a direct object, it's passing it back to the subject. The subject is passive. It's receiving the action rather than performing it. Often the doer is named in that prepositional phrase that I was talking about. It probably comes at the end of the sentence, and you may have multiple prepositional phrases. A verb in the passive voice is always in a verb phrase. Remember, I mentioned helping verbs. So you are going to see the is, are, was, were, be, being, and been. You're going to see those pop up with your passive verbs. So here's an example. The Israelites were led out of Egypt by Moses. So we know it's the Israelites. What were the Israelites doing? Well, they were led. And who were they led by? Well, that would be Moses and out of Egypt. Those would pop up as prepositional phrases under your verb. So the Israelites are receiving the action. And instead of it being passed on to a direct object. So clues for the passive voice, look for that helping verb and look for those prepositional phrases coming at the end. And that will almost always clue you in that you've got passive. All right, let's take a look. And I'm sorry about my pictures. My phone is not taking great pictures, so this is as good as it gets at the moment. So on page 332, take a look at the examples of how the verb, the different verb tenses and forms and how they progress. So we can look at present. These heifers are fed plenty of hay. That's present tense. These heifers were fed, past tense. These heifers will be fed. So they've got the helping verb there. These heifers have been fed, past perfect. These heifers had been fed, and then future, these heifers will have been fed. So they can be used in the passive voice. Okay, progressive, I don't spend a whole lot of time on this, but if you look down here, it says progressive forms and the passive voice follow the pattern are being fed, and then it shows you what gets added to that. These progressive forms occur mainly in the simple present and past tenses. They're not common in the other tenses. The heifers are being fed plenty of hay. That's present progressive. Here's the past. The heifers were being fed plenty of hay. I don't so much care if you know the progressive piece of that. I do want you to understand the active and the passive, but I don't really get nitpicky about whether you understand the progressive. Okay, the new concept that I wanted to talk about is the retained object. Now, we could argue about that object and whether it is truly an indirect object or whether it becomes an object of the preposition. So let's take a look at what I'm talking about here. So it shows us a progression on page 332. So if you want to take a look at your book, it starts off with Hannah made a coat. We've got a direct object. Hannah made what? A coat. Now, if I was going to change that to passive, I would change it to a coat was made by Hannah. And this has the direct object. So there's the maker. I'm sorry, not a direct object. The maker is in the prepositional phrase. Okay, here we go again. Let's start over. Hannah made Samuel a coat. Now we have an indirect object in Samuel. But it asks us, can this sentence be rewritten so that the direct object becomes the subject? And yes, that can be done. Here is that sentence. A coat was made Samuel by Hannah. Now this is awkward wording, and I don't generally encourage people to write in such awkward wording. I would probably tell you not to try to do the retained object. This rewritten sentence is in the passive voice. The subject is receiving the action, but there were two objects in the previous sentence, Samuel and coat. So the question here is what happened to the other, and the other shows up right here by Hannah. Now, the argument by some is that that is still an indirect object. The argument by others is that it is a retained object. I don't care which one you use it as, because in a second we're going to see that it's diagrammed in the same way, and I don't actually test you on this, but I just want you to get it kind of in the back of your mind that, oh yeah, retained object. So here's how it's diagrammed. Hannah made what? A coat, and Hannah made Samuel. So here we know that for sure it is an indirect object, and that's how we would diagram it. Now the passive voice with the retained indirect objects is something like this. A coat was made Samuel by Hannah. Coat was made, so then we put Samuel right there. That still stays as the indirect. And then by Hannah goes also under the verb, and you could argue either one. It's still that retained or still part of the retained, or it is a prepositional phrase. Whoops, my slide moved. Sorry about that. And here it is with the passive voice. Samuel was made a coat by Hannah, and here that is again. So whether it is a prepositional phrase like here, or whether it is that retain direct object, it is going to be diagrammed the very same way. So don't spend a whole lot of time trying to figure out, oh, do I have one of those retained indirect objects or a retained direct object? Instead, just worry about whether you have active or passive voice. So I want to spend a couple of minutes doing the class practice just so that I know that you know how to identify active and passive. So I want you to take a minute to pause and complete 1 through 5, and then I will share the answers with you. Okay, if you're back, then hopefully you've done the class practice. And if you do, bring your paper in and tell me that you did the class practice, and I will have some sort of surprise for you. There's going to be all kinds of Valentine's treats at school next week. So let's take a look. Number 1, the righteous seek the glory of God. Seek is active, and glory is what the action gets passed to. Number 2, the righteous will always be blessed by God. Will be blessed is passive, and righteous is what is getting the action. Number 3, God's angels are sent as ministering spirits to the saints. Are sent is the verb, which is passive, and then angels get the action. Angels have spoken God's message to men, have spoken, and that's active, and then message is the direct object. And number 5, Lot and his family were urged by 2 angels to flee from Sodom. Were urged is passive. Lot and family are what gets the action. All right, now hit pause again, and I want you to complete 1 through 4, and then I will give you the answers. Okay, if you are back, then you need the answers for B. And let's do B1. Many wildflowers were identified by Uncle Harold. And what we're supposed to do is rewrite this in the active voice. So what I do is I pull my subject out of that prepositional phrase and then complete my sentence. So my sentence would be, Uncle Harold identified many wildflowers. Then number 2, this meal was furnished the workers by several local families. And I would rewrite, several local families furnished the workers this meal. Number 3, a pleasant surprise has been planned by Father. And I would rewrite something like, Father has planned a pleasant surprise. And then number 4, a short visit will be paid Sister Arlene by our class. And instead I would rewrite, our class will pay Sister Arlene a short visit. So sometimes you have to change the format of some of the words. But hopefully you understand what we're doing here. Let me know if you have any questions on the homework, and I will see you Wednesday.